Okay, as everybody continues to stream in, I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Chelsea Lake. Welcome again to PNP Live. I'm a member of the special events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore. Before we get started, as I said, a few housekeeping notes. I will be dropping a link in the chat so that you can purchase the Uninnocent Notes on Violence and Mercy. You can ask a question by using the Q&A feature, which is located along the bottom of your screen. In that menu along the bottom of your screen, just pop it open and type your question at any time during the event. We'll save time towards the latter part of the hour and ask our questions then. We are also delighted to offer closed captioning for this event. Just look for the live transcript option also along the bottom of your screen. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Katharine Blake is an adjunct professor at Vermont Law School's Center for Justice Reform. She received her JD with pro bono distinction from Stanford Law School, where she was an editor of the Stanford Law and Policy Review. She's taught English at San Quentin Prison and served as director of special projects for the Children's Defense Fund. She lives with her family in Virginia. Stephanie Danler is a novelist and screenwriter. She is the author of the memoir, Stray, the international bestseller, Sweet Bitter, and the creator and executive producer of the Sweet Bitter TV series. Her work has appeared in Vogue, the New York Times Book Review, and the Paris Review Daily. She lives in Los Angeles. It's my pleasure to welcome you both to PNP Live. Ladies, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Katharine, hello.
Hello.
I'm so excited to finally be talking to you. This feels like it has been many months in coming.
Mm-hmm. It has been.
Yeah, I think I read this before it was bound, actually.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Early copy of it. And I have some questions. I had some questions about that, but I'm going to let you talk in a second about what your book is about, because I feel like these days of virtual events, a lot of people have the book but haven't finished it yet, which is
that's right. Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah.
But before that, I wanted to talk about kind of my connection with it. And I don't know whether you knew this when your editor sent it to me, but I was raised in a family of lawyers, old school county prosecutors, LA County. And my mom was a court clerk, my stepfather prosecutor, my aunt and my uncle prosecutor. And it was always assumed that I was going to go to law school. That was what my sister and I were supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't, for a lot of reasons that we could talk about over a drink. But I do feel like one of my early rebellions, like after I was an atheist and after I was a Marxist, was to start being critical of the criminal justice system.
Yeah,
this was a way of rebelling against my family. And so as I was reading this, I was like, oh my God, I'm her ideal reader. You know, I'm interested in the law. I'm interested in the criminal justice system. I have some familiarity with it, but I'm a lay person as well.
Yeah, right.
And so I loved the book. That's how I want to start.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You are my ideal reader for many reasons, but one of them is, yes, having some familiarity, but not too much familiarity, so that the things that I'm talking about aren't, overly obvious.
Do you want to tell us a little bit what your book's about?
Definitely. So the book is about a lot of things, perhaps too many things, but the inspiration for the book was this crime that happened where my cousin, who was 16 years old, had a psychotic break and murdered a child. He didn't know the child. The child was riding by on his bicycle, and that morning that my cousin left his home, he never went back home. He was arrested right after the crime and put in jail, and has spent the rest of his life incarcerated. He's now serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole at Angola, a maximum security prison in Louisiana. And when this happened, I was sorry.
It's the worst prison. I'm going to, I want you to keep going. It is generally considered to be the worst prison in the United States, where there are a lot of terrible prisons. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was in law school when this happened. I had just finished my first year of law school. It happened in the summer after my first year. And my initial reaction to this crime was like, I was immersed in kind of binary thinking. So when my mother called to tell me about it, I felt instantly pulled between the loyalty that I knew I was supposed to feel for my family and this very strong sense that, he was the perpetrator, he was the murderer, and this other family had lost their child. What became clear to me over days and weeks and months and then years, in sort of deeper and deeper layers, was the extent to which both families had lost their children that day that this thing happened. And then simultaneously, as I was in law school and watching my cousin go through the legal process of being charged and convicted as an adult and sentenced for the rest of his life, I think it had a huge impact on what I studied, what I paid attention to, and what I cared about in law school, and then later as in my life. So I took juvenile justice, and I taught at juvenile detention facilities, and this crime was kind of behind all of these choices I was making. I worked at the Children's Defense Fund. So the book, that's kind of where the book's, that's the narrative of the book. But then I also in the book explore this concept of heartbreak, because heartbreak felt like the most descriptive word in relation to this tragedy, but then also a whole lot of other things that I was seeing, in these years of my life that the book covers. Is that too much? Have I just been rambling?
No.
Okay.
No. I think the narrative journey, I think you nailed, which is actually my first question, which is, at what point did you become conscious that Scott's crime was subconsciously directing everything that you were doing? Because when you write in the book, you just happen to be seeking out these teachers and kind of mentors. But at a certain point, you must have realized that it was unconsciously pushing your life.
I think so. I think it was embarrassingly late, though. I mean, partly this sort of serendipitous thing happened, and I know that's a weird word to use in this context, but when I got back to law school for my second year, Bryan Stevenson came to the law school to speak, and I had never heard of him, but he was accepting an award, and I'll just never forget.
Tell us who he is. Tell the rest of us.
Sorry. So Bryan Stevenson is he's an attorney and an advocate. He's the founder of Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. He's argued several Supreme Court cases, mostly about juvenile life sentences. And he's an author. He has a book called Just Mercy. And he's like he's a bright light. He's an incredible teacher. But anyway, so I heard him speak, and he really opened up. He was talking about how the law treats young people who commit terrible crimes, and he was talking with compassion, and he was talking, and what he said made so much sense to me. And he was talking about darkness, and I think it really forged, like, hearing him right after this thing had happened really also impacted my choices and my journey. But to answer your question, I want to say it was like years, maybe when I was still in law school, maybe like my third year, so a couple years after the crime. But I really was operating pretty unconsciously. Also, I was in my 20s, and like for most of my 20s, I was sort of an unconscious person. Like I wasn't very reflective. So yeah, it took me a while to sort of put the pieces together and see this is it was all connected.
Yeah. And then, so that's one, there's also a way in which the book is a journey back to your cousin,
Yeah.
to
Right.
seeing him, to being able to face him, to
Yeah.
have come to a place of mercy, if not forgiveness, or
Yeah.
a new place, right? There's the movement
Yeah.
of the character who is you. And at the same time, I found myself wondering, what was the journey of the writer? And I think that it's always interesting, but here you are not, you're not in school for writing. And
Right.
yet this book must have been started to form at a certain point. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about when you thought this has some sort of cohesive nature, that it might be a book, that I might be
Yeah.
able to contribute to this conversation.
Yeah.
And when did you start writing it?
Yeah. It's a great question. I really didn't want to write about this. Like, I really tried not to write about it. It didn't feel like it was my place to write about it. And I didn't want to go back into this, time. And I didn't want to think about some of these things. So, that's just to say that what I tried to do was write a book about heartbreak without this story. And that's what I started working on first. I wanted it to be really I wanted it to have no memoir. I wanted it to be entirely, outward looking and facing, and be analytical and historical and literary. I had these ideas. I was going to delve into this concept of heartbreak and explore the concept and the word, where it came from, how it shows up now, how it looks in the body. So I did get to do a lot of those things in this book, but I think it was my agent who sort of said, well, where's the story? I was like, there doesn't need to be a story. What story? Why does there have to be a story? And then I started, it's about getting honest. So when I was able to really get honest with myself and look at my own life, following the cord of heartbreak in my own life inevitably led me back towards my cousin and this thing that had happened. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think people ask often about, how do you write a memoir, right? How it's so difficult, it's so painful. And I think that it's really shocking when people get into it. There's a version of every great memoir that is a lie.
Yeah.
Right. And that version, some of those versions are published, where it's just people are skirting uncomfortable realities and they don't want to turn the lens back on themselves.
Yeah.
But I think and I didn't know anything about memoir. I was trying to write one. I read a ton of them.
Yeah.
And I was like, the ones that really shine have a kind of ruthlessness to them. And for how beautiful and lyrical Uninnocent is, it is fucking ruthless. It's not pleasant to read. There's a way in which you're trying to make sense of suffering. And to do that, you must collect suffering.
Yeah.
And I, as a reader, there's a voyeuristic pleasure in reading about sad things that aren't happening to you.
Yeah.
But even just when you were talking at the intro, my eyes are watering. You're dealing with unbearably painful experiences. And I think I have a question. I'm leading to a question about how it felt to write all of this, but just so you hear from a reader, the testimony from Ryan's family, mother's there, the court case, the testimony from Scott's father, I'm like, I'm never going to stop crying. I'll never stop. And maybe it's because I have small children, but I actually think it's pretty universal. This, you're writing to such a tender spot. And so how did it feel to write that?
Thank you for that question and for what you said. It did not feel good. It did not feel good. It didn't feel good, obviously. When it was happening, it didn't feel good. And going back to it wasn't really terribly fun either. But I will say the only way I was able to write this book, I think there were two like tricks that kind of allowed me to like finish and keep going. One of them was to tell myself that I might not publish it, that like I didn't have to publish it. Yeah. And then, but I said, okay, I'm just going to finish it. I might not be able to publish this, but I'm going to write it. I'm going to finish it, because if I don't finish it, there's no choice. Right. And then the other thing that I did was I made it like a math problem rather than an emotional or metaphysical problem. So it was like, I want there to be this many words in this book. I have to write this many words per month, per week, per day. And then I just wrote. Yeah. And I was really, I mean, I was really crazy. And I sort of rewrote the whole thing in like 3 months. And so it was like this whirlwind where I would just, the babysitter would come, I would say goodbye to my son. I would go across the street to the library, often in my slippers, and like write furiously for 3 hours, trying to meet these, goals, these word count goals I set out. And then I went home to him and I made him lunch and put him down for a nap. It wasn't easy, but I think like just, I don't know. And also like all that stuff that's true that people say about like writing about something, you don't actually have to relive it. Like you are safe when you're writing about the hardest things that have happened in your life. Like you're not going to these people aren't going to come out of the page and hurt you. You're not going to actually like transport yourself back in time and have to relive, and so creating a little bit of space, making it practical rather than just like this arduous emotional journey allowed me to actually complete the process. But sure, I mean, there were dark days. And, I said to my husband numerous times, like, why couldn't I have just written about something happy? But we don't really choose, I don't think,
No, I'm listening to this podcast about Bennington College in the 80s, which is a tangent, but there is this great, which has me like in a Donna Tartt world. And there's a great line at the beginning of The Secret History. And it's like, this is the only story I'll ever tell. Like there are certain things that happen to you where this is really, and it doesn't mean you're never going to write another book, but like this is the story that you have to tell.
Right. Maybe in order to tell anything else, right? In order to move on and to like have your imagination open and your heart open, there are probably some things, there's like some work all of us have to do. And whether it takes the form of writing or some other form, you've got to move through it. Life is hard. There's a lot of shit that happens to people. It's really hard.
There's something in Uninnocent that you talk about that I think is probably relevant to this moment in your life, where how do you make sense of your clean sheets and your stacked linens and the suffering that in certain scenes is taking place on the street when you're living in San Francisco, or the fact that your cousin is in solitary confinement or he's not on death row. Was he in solitary confinement?
He was on death row and now he's not anymore.
While you are like fighting with while I'm fighting with my husband about what to watch on Netflix, like there's a cognitive dissonance there that I think everyone I know is struggling with all the time. And so while life is hard, life is also not that hard.
Yeah, totally. Yep. Absolutely. It's unbearable almost that space between experience, and if you can almost lose yourself to it, I think, and I don't know, sometimes I struggle with the idea that I should lose myself to it. Like, what would it look like if we all lost ourselves to that space between those who are suffering the most and our comfortable lives? Like, imagine what service we could be, I mean, that's why saints are saints. And the rest of us are just like trying to like get through the day. That doesn't mean that we're not capable of really, truly great things in our small, comfortable lives. And I'm not talking about everybody or even you, Stephanie. I'm talking about my own small, comfortable life right now. But I do think, I think like I look at somebody like Brian Stevenson, who has dedicated his life to this. And which is not to say that his life isn't comfortable. I don't know anything about his personal life, but I can tell he has made a decision that this is what he's going to do with his life. And he's going to follow that call wherever it leads. Whereas I think I pulled back. Like, I wanted to have a family and a wedding and, like, I don't know, buy a house. Like, I pulled back, I stepped back. And I don't think that's something that I totally reconciled myself to yet with any comfort.
Well, I think that that's still a process, right? Because for someone like me who considers themselves like, I'm not an activist, because Brian Stevenson is an activist, but I
hear you though, of course.
I'm an active citizen, but like your whole journey has been about service and has been in some ways about children and protecting children. And so I would say, like, you're in progress with that.
Yeah.
There are periods right now. You've got she has an 8-month-old baby, everyone, and a toddler, which is just like being trapped in a cage with wild animals. So I would give yourself a little space there. I wanted to ask, I guess some of these questions, I just want your opinion. They were questions that I arose while reading. So much of this book is a meditation on, like, what a child is and how the criminal justice system treats a child. And I used to think a lot about, my aunt tried the Menendez trial, the first one, and I grew up going to that trial, which is crazy because I was 10, but everyone in my family is crazy. And I later would think, like, Eric Menendez was barely 18. He was 6 months, 18 years old. Like, what happened in those 6 months that made him different? And able to be tried differently. And, like, I'm wondering, what's the distinction for you? Like, when you're talking about what a child is, I know this is a crazy question, but it sits on me. It sits on me with issues of consent as well, like sexual
100%.
consent. I'm like, what is every 18-year-old young woman in exactly the same place at the exact same capability to make a decision as every 18-year-old white man with a gun? Like, are they all equally liable? Like, I'm just curious what you think. What is a child when you're fighting for children?
Yeah, great question. I do not know. Of course, I don't know. But I certainly think it should be older. I think it should be older than 18. And also, the law can magically decide to try a child as an adult. So it's sort of like, I'm just taking your question one step further, which is like, okay, so normally we think of children as under 18, or in some states, actually, there's this big movement to raise the age, both raise the age from the bottom up, and so, like, you're moving the whole spectrum up. So, like, you cannot try a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old as an adult in some states, and you cannot, and then minors are considered in some places up until 21. So that's a big movement that advocates are pursuing right now. But I hear you. I think all the brain science is pretty solid at this point, that brains don't stop developing until roughly 25, and in males later than females. So I think, it really raises some interesting questions about culpability when you are, when you're treating somebody who, because of neuroscience, doesn't even have everything that he needs yet to make good decisions. And you're treating him as an adult, and you're saying what you've done is so bad that we're going to treat you as an adult. It's really like the only word that comes to mind is insanity. Like, it's kind of like a formalized insanity that our system perpetuates.
Well, why do we need it? Like, what, like, why? like, I mean, why do we need it? Then you have to ask why we need a crime and punishment system that meets violence with violence, but which is another question that's coming.
I know.
You know? But, I think, like, I guess when you're talking about that, what I'm thinking about is this question that kind of haunts the entire book, even your parents, like, can people change? You're talking about your relationship with your father. And I think that if you don't believe that people can change, this is a very simple black and white issue, which is that the 14-year-old that commits murder there's no possibility that they can ever become anything other than a murderer, that they are broken and should be removed from society.
Right.
And I think a lot of people unconsciously or consciously believe that others cannot change.
Yeah.
And so that is like, that seems like a bigger question you're asking.
It is. I think you got to the heart of it. I think that's really the question at the heart of so much of this sentencing policy, because a life sentence without the possibility of parole for anybody, full stop, not just children, not just people under 18, but anybody, is doubling down on the idea that people cannot change. Or, I guess, sort of a parallel rationale is that we don't care if they change because we want to punish them so severely for what they've done. In either case, what a terrible impetus for policy making. Like, what a terrible rationale that undergirds our laws. It's like something when you say it just, because we all have proof that people can change. Yes, not everybody changes, not in the ways that we want. Not everybody can meet, their truest potential before they die. But everybody can change. I have proof, like, we have the proof. And it's really particularly crazy not to provide that chance to children who have an actual, biological enhanced capacity for change.
Yes. And I think that as you're saying that, and I'm not playing devil's advocate, although I can, because I was raised by all these prosecutors who believe that without law, there's no order. Without order, we are back to like a savage, like survival system.
Right.
And that when you take someone, I think my aunt would argue that when you take someone's life, you give up your right to life.
Yeah.
And that there is something just and like sensical about that logic. And I think where that style of thinking fails is imagining a paradigm outside of just darkness, right?
Yeah, right.
Like, even though the same people we were just talking about the death penalty before we signed on, the same people that believe that the death penalty makes sense. And I think that it sounds barbaric. It's one of those things that, like, in 100 years, they're going to look back and be like, those Romans were really disgusting and off base.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a kind of like ease in the one-to-one thinking.
Totally. It is ease. And it's, you described it as sense. And I think that's right. That's a generous reading. And I think in the book, I try to talk about it as the difference between fairness and justice. That it is fair, right? If somebody takes a life, they give up their own life. We deprive them of freedom or their actual physical breathing life. That is fair. You can't argue that it's not fair. You can argue that it's not just, because justice is so much like bigger and deeper and richer. And I think what I came to as I wrote the book was that justice necessarily involves mercy, that it sort of has to. Like, my working definition of justice involves mercy, and fairness doesn't have to.
But I think most people
Yeah.
I think that most people's idea of justice in their day-to-day life, when they're not thinking it theoretically about a system,
Yeah.
is if your child misbehaves,
Right.
a mistake, you meet them with discipline and mercy.
Right.
I think that most of us intrinsically, that is where we go to. But again, we're talking about a different scale, and we're talking about the loss of life, which you put it in the book in a category of evil.
Yeah.
You know, it feels different. It is different
It
than
is different.
any other crime.
Yeah, it is. It's the worst thing in many ways. It's the worst thing. And it's terrifying to us that it can happen. I mean, I think one of the things that I sort of explored just a little bit in the book was this idea that, you know, we're so afraid of murder, rightly so, but I think we other the murderer, we other somebody who can take a life because we can't bear to imagine that being close to us, or something that we could do, or something that could happen to us, or something that could happen to someone we love, all of that. And so we like push it away, and we but it lives really right next to life. Like, you know, death lives right next to life, and whether it's intentional or accidental. And that's like a discomfort that, you know, especially in this country, we don't deal with death well. And I do not mean to minimize murder. I hope that's not how it sounds. I do think that it is the worst crime. Yeah.
I think that your book takes it very seriously. Okay. And so if there's a shorthand here, that's because we both have read the book.
Right. Right.
Saying, no, murder is I mean, you qualify it as evil.
Right.
Yeah. But does evil necessarily exclude mercy? And I don't know. I think that your part of your journey is to find space and definitions, right? That's something that's going on in the book, like evil and what else?
I think that's right. Yeah, I like that, space and definitions. Yeah, I think I'm really interested in the definitions of words and how they do their work on us, like as we live with them. And so like blowing open words and kind of understanding where does this word come from and how are we using it is interesting to me. And I think, you know, vis-a-vis the word evil, I will say, and I do own in the book, that the way that this crime felt, it felt evil. And I don't even know how to explain that, right? Like that's something that's hard. It's hard to explain that feeling. It felt like something that came out of nowhere, you know, like just, you know, ripped through my cousin's brain, and he wasn't himself, you know. And so I think there's this like sort of this idea of haunting, or what's the word I'm looking for? Possession. You know, where he wasn't himself, he was possessed by something else. You can call it mental illness, and I think that's right. And then other people call it evil. I think what I come to in the book is that it doesn't really matter, like that space between those terms, psychotic break, evil. I don't know that it matters, because I think what we have to decide is how we want to live and how we want to treat one another in this world. And so what does goodness look like? Certainly we don't want to mimic evil with evil, right? So if it's evil to take a life, like, what other argument do we need to make against the death penalty or against life sentences? Right. So
no, it is. It's a reinforcement of the crime in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a section that is not about prison reform, but you're getting letters from prisoners, and it feels like one era of your what's the time in the book? Is it 8 years or 10 years from
Great question.
The crime to
2010. 2010 to so it's 8 years.
So during the 8 years, at one point you're working where were you working when you were
Yeah,
working?
so it was the National Prison Project. It's like this little branch of the ACLU, and it's just this group of like 5 attorneys who it's their job to sue prisons. That's what they do, which was awesome. It was so cool. They were all so cool, like those attorneys. They were so badass, and yeah, I really like. I struggled a lot in law school, and still sometimes do, about the like bringing suit as a tool for solving things, but there was something so satisfying about using this huge heavy tool of the class action lawsuit against prisons, you know, especially private prisons. Like that was just very satisfying.
And I mean, I'm just curious, why can't we reform our prisons in America?
Oh.
I mean, we
Oh
opens up a 1,000-page book. Let me tell you.
Yeah.
Why can't we? I mean, I feel, and listen, I say this stuff as someone who has lived on both coasts. And so when I say everyone I know, I'm talking about a very teeny tiny pool.
Right.
But
Sure.
I feel like there is enough in the mainstream media about what's going on with prison. And not just the conditions, but just how the entire system is a form of extended slavery, or like, it just, and why can't we make the change? Why are we so dependent on it?
Yeah. There's such a, you know, it's such an important question, and it gets to the heart of this, this thing that's happened in this country where we have just become much too inured and used to extreme punishment in the form of incarceration as our only response to people who break the law. So reform, I mean, and this is what makes me feel like an abolitionist. I think that we may be past reform. Like, I think the whole thing needs to be torn down. I don't mean everybody, not that anybody on here is going to get mad at me for saying this, but to the people who would get mad at me for saying that, I don't mean we should open the doors of the prisons and let everybody, you know, free tonight. Although I think certainly there are many people who should walk free tonight. I know that that's not something we can do for anybody's sake. But as a system, I don't see a path. I don't see a path of reform, really. I don't, because we are so sick. We are so sick. I mean, there's 2 million people in prison right now, in prison and jail in this country, 2 million people. We are so way far and beyond any other country in the world. I just don't know how you walk it back, you know, like we have a real soul sickness.
I mean, I want to know what that looks like, but I feel like that is a tangent. Like, I'm genuinely curious what you think that looks like, because this is something that you have been involved in and studying since before we all watched the 13th. Like, this was, and so I'm curious, like, and then of course in 2020 with this real significant push to abolish the police, like,
I know,
what does that, it feels like it's so tied up in money that it is like, it's impossible to parse apart or to break open or even have a conversation.
I think everything comes back to capitalism, don't you? Right? I mean, if you trace the thread of every sort of quote unquote problem, as you and I would understand that word to describe in our country, like, it all goes back to capitalism. You know,
I think
it's all money.
You start to, well, that's a question, actually. You have some thoughts on violence, right? And your cousin Scott, you do place him within a canon. A canon is the wrong word. A canon is a lovely set of texts. That's not what I mean, but you do place him
a tradition. I know,
tradition of
cohort.
Newton, Connecticut, Sandy Hook, Charleston church murder.
Right.
And so, and you talk about this sort of this sickness, as you just called it, that is at the root of American history, and this white, adolescent white male violence. I mean, do you trace that back to capitalism? I mean, I'm just curious.
Great question. I mean, certainly I don't know that I have before, but like I'm trying to do it right now in my mind. And yes, I think the answer would inevitably be yes. I certainly trace it back to slavery, which connects us to capitalism. So I think, yeah, I mean, what Brian Stevenson says is that until we face slavery and are able to understand that legacy and really understand it, not like the way that we all know, oh yes, we all know that our country was founded, in this way, and that there's like blood in the soil, and that this original sin is something, we know it, but do we really feel it? Like, do we feel it? Do we know it? Have we processed it as a people? I don't think so. I mean, I know not. So I do think that somehow the violence of young white males, I mean, obviously it's an obvious connection when you're talking about Charleston, South Carolina. It's less obvious in these other crimes that are not inspired by racial animus and by racism. But there's just like a fury and a fear, right, that's behind this violence. And that certainly goes back to our origins.
Mm-hmm. I have a million more questions for you, but I've got some good ones. And
Yeah.
And to the person who just asked a question in the chat, I will fold that into the Q&A. This first one was going to be my closer, but anonymous attendee, I'll let you have it. How did motherhood affect your relationship to this book and or the story of your cousin at the center of it?
Okay, I'm going to try not to cry. I don't know if that's the key.
I'm going to try not to cry too. Oh no, I'm scared. Okay, go ahead.
I think,
I'm crying. I'm already crying.
What I was going to say is just that a few things. First of all, motherhood, what doesn't motherhood change? Like motherhood changes everything, or it has for me. But I will never forget going to visit my cousin in prison for the first time since this had happened. And, waiting for him in the holding cell and or in this visitation room where I was waiting. And he comes in and his face appears at this window. And I'm about, 4 months pregnant with my son at this point. And it's like a tiny explosion of one of those personal epiphanies that's so obvious, but for some reason hadn't occurred to me, that he too was a baby inside his mother's belly. And that all people are, and therefore all people should be treated with a level of dignity that our current system it doesn't treat people with the dignity that human life deserves, no matter what somebody has done. So motherhood really helped me understand that in a kind of like physical, personal way. And then, just I think in terms of living in a world where your child can be murdered, living in a world where your child can be a murderer, both things are true. And so there's just a lot of letting go that's required of raising kids, like that we do the best we can, but we can't protect them from everything. And so whatever it is, faith or prayer or, just like pumping them with as much love as you can and then letting them go, because their paths, like our children's paths, lead away from us, and that's how you want it to be. But it can feel like a very scary world. And so I think, one of the things I've tried to focus on in my children's life and in my son's life is just like really showing him how beautiful things can be, really showing him how beautiful the world can be, because he will find out about all the rest inevitably. And I don't know what's going to happen to him, but I can show him how beautiful it is to be here, like this planet. I don't want to keep going because I'm getting really going off on a tangent, but just like planet Earth is amazing. That's all. I'll close with that.
You've read that Maggie Smith poem.
Yeah,
It's like,
of course.
yeah, everyone about like motherhood of a terrible world. I'm going to put it in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah.
What was the most disappointing thing you learned about what happened, about policy, about your family while you were writing this book?
Most disappointing thing. I don't know why that question makes me laugh.
Book.
Yeah.
I have the answer. No, it's not. Being with your character in the memoir during Sandy Hook and really believing that gun control was around the corner.
Yeah, good
and
answer.
the average reader being like, there's no gun control. Like, what is she talking about? Why does she keep saying that gun control is going to happen? I felt for the you of that time. And all of us who hope for things.
I know, right? You feel like such a sucker, right? Like, and I mean, that's the problem with hope, is that you look back and you're like, man, I can't believe I was so naive and so stupid to think that Congress would pass gun legislation, gun safety legislation. I was sure of it. I told everybody I was sure of it. I couldn't have been more sure. And I was entirely wrong. I think that is this sort of central point in the book of heaviness and disappointment. You're absolutely right. Like that's like the low point. And, I leave my job. Like, and I'm not proud of that. I always think back on that moment and think, God, people have just, like, the people who are fighting these fights, they have just been through disappointment after disappointment. And they keep going and they find a way to keep going. And like, that's why I really like this idea of hope as a discipline. You actually have to work really hard to stay hopeful and to stay in the fight, whatever your fight is, for progress. But at that moment, I just thought, F this, like, I'm out. What are we even doing? What is Congress even doing? What is, like, every nonprofit doing? It was one of those moments of like, how can this be?
I think most of us, we all feel that way.
Yeah.
What is anyone even doing? All of you are supposed to be in charge of something.
Yeah, right. I know that point in your life where you realize that there's no secret room of grownups who are going to fix everything. Like, or maybe I know for you, Stephanie, you probably learned that really young because of your family. But from like a sort of political standpoint, like, there's nobody who's going to fix this. Like, we are the ones. We are the only ones.
Next question. Katharine mentioned at the beginning of the conversation the passage of time and the act of revisiting that came with writing this book. What, if anything, do you think came of that temporal distance? Did you learn anything with like the distance?
Over the years. So like writing about it 8 years after that happened.
Yeah.
Of course. I mean, it would be sad if I didn't. I mean, I'm sure I learned a lot writing. I will say that. I probably didn't learn as much as I could have over the 8 years that passed between the crime and writing about it. The writing itself was probably where I learned the most. Writing, if you're a certain kind of person who, like, I think that I now think best in writing. Like, it's really how I get clear about something. I don't know if you feel that way too, Stephanie, but yeah. So I just, I learned the most probably writing, but sure, what I learned in terms of the distance between the crime and writing was like this idea that life does go on, which is sort of like a theme that the book ends on, is this idea of ongoingness, that time passes, which is not to say that all of our heartbreaks will heal and that time heals all. Time does not heal all. I really don't think that time heals all for everybody, but time does change things. And um, and I certainly understood things differently. And I understood that like life was going to keep going and time was going to keep marching on. So you can kind of decide to like be all in or not.
Yes. This is from Diana Solis, and I'm going to read the whole thing just so you can hear it. Jeff and I feel so honored to know you and love you, Katharine. Thank you for your courage in bringing this book to life. What kinds of questions are readers grappling with as they read your book? What are you hearing from readers? And I think this is a great one, actually.
Yeah.
We were talking about this right before we went live.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you mean when we were talking about the op-ed?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, thank you for that question, Diana. Hi, Diana and Jeff. I think that it's you know, that there are, how do I say this? Like there are, in every one of our lives, there are places that feel broken. And so, you know, as people have started to read the book and you know, tell me things that have come up for them, I think I've been struck by how, like, you know, so I'm talking about a legal situation, but it reminds a friend of her, you know, her family's difficulty, which doesn't have anything to do with the law, but is a trauma that she's working through nonetheless, or, you know, an illness or infertility, or, you know, people have like brought their own, I guess it's the category of heartbreak, you know, that people like, they are reminded of or immersed in their own sense of their own heartbreaks as they read the book. But I don't know, it's still early. I feel like I'll have a better answer for that in a few days when I hear from more people, you know, just people, like not that many people have read it yet. So I may know more soon.
Another person just said that they read the comments to your recent Washington Post article, which Katharine did not, so we don't need to disabuse her.
I did not.
Moment.
Right.
But I read some of them as well. This person, our attendee, felt like resigning from the human race from reading those. Can your book possibly help some of these people see the light? And I think that I'm going to add a little to that and just say that reading those comments, I was really struck, as I always am, by how small my world is.
Yeah.
Of progressively minded liberals. Sounds terrible when you say it like that. And, you know, my aunt and I will still argue about the death penalty from time to time, but she's moved away from it, even though she argued many death penalty cases, some of them successfully, and really believed in the work that she was doing. And so I'm familiar, but I think there's something about this idea of mercy that really feels like the end of civilization to people.
Yeah, right.
And yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, you know, I've thought about it a lot over the last couple of days, because although I didn't read any of the comments, I was aware of them, and people were sort of, and sometimes, you know, some people took it upon themselves to like write me, you know, through my website, or like find me on other things like Instagram and tell me what they thought.
It's amazing.
So I was aware. Yeah,
that.
I know. Yeah. So I was aware of the nature of the comments, and, you know, something that I two things. What it felt to me was just like how much pain was in that comment section. Like there was just so much pain and suffering. People are so afraid. And I think what I want to just acknowledge is like the details of this story of my cousin's crime are really harrowing. And when you first hear about it and learn about it, it makes sense to me that your brain sort of goes like, ah, you know, like, I can't. Like, I can't. Yes, that person should be in prison for the rest of his life or worse, you know, and that's what a lot of the comments sort of said in various forms. I get it. I think the problem is not that feeling, it's enacting policies based on that feeling. It's like, that's a perfectly human reaction to a horrible event or a horrible story. But our policies and our society, which is like, built on our laws and our policies, we don't have to reflect our first thoughts, our first instincts, which are largely animal instincts in some ways. We are mammals after all. And so like things like this, it's like, it really is kind of a fight or flight response that gets kicked in. And the other thing I was thinking about today, as I was trying to think of it, like everybody in that comment section, I bet, is thinking about somebody that they love, that they could not bear the loss of, right? Like they're thinking about what would happen if their own child was killed or someone that they loved. And so I was just trying to think of it a little bit more instead of like, oh, people are so stupid. Of like, people are just like, this is the expression of their love and they are very afraid. People are very afraid right now. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that, your answer was really beautiful because first thought is not best thought.
Right, exactly.
I think maybe like, I love that as a response to this because it diffuses a situation instead of launching into a debate with people who feel passionately that from reading this article that Scott should never see the light of day again. Like instead of trying to tell them, here are all the reasons why you don't know Scott, you don't understand, here's all the mitigating evidence, aka storytelling. That was one of my questions that we didn't get to. You're instead just taking a step back and making space for these same people to have a variety of experiences with your story. It is harrowing. It is harrowing. I can't tell you how hard that was to read. And the first instinct is what you went through. Monster.
Exactly.
Monster, get it this away from me. Like, keep it out of my ether, evil monster. Like, it's so clear.
That's exactly right. And I also think that people like just really want to feel heard, and inevitably comment sections on the internet turn into spaces where they feel like they can be heard. And so they use their voices in really loud, scary ways. But, the one person that I wrote back, somebody wrote me on Instagram and I wrote her back. And I just said, like, I really hear you. I'm so sorry that you felt that I was being insensitive to victims. And, here's what I was trying to say. And thank you so much for writing. And she wrote back and said, like, wow, you really didn't have to write me. Like, thank you so much for writing me back. I totally see where you're coming from. I misunderstood your point. It's like, it's such a tiny example, but that is possible one-to-one. I don't know how we replicate that on like grander scales. But I do believe in that. I do believe that people just like want their pain to be like beheld and witnessed.
I am getting a 1 minute till the hour. And I have a perfect last question from our anonymous attendee. What do you hope people take away from this book? Which I feel like you were just starting to talk about.
Yeah. Just like mercy. I think that when we live in a country where our policies are merciless, it certainly reflects the way that we relate to one another in other fields and the way that we relate to ourselves, and how harmful it is to ourselves to live in a place that treats people who have done wrong without mercy. That isn't who we have to be. And so I hope the book opens up like a tiny space for understanding responses to crime, other responses to crime, and to our own heartbreaks.
My God. Light fare, little rom-com, beach read, everyone. Katharine, thank you so much. Thank you for our beautiful questions, everyone here. And thank you, Politics and Prose, the best bookstore in all the land.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Stephanie, for really such a fascinating and important conversation. I wish we had more time. Alas, it is the bottom of the hour, so I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. As a gentle reminder, I've put the link to the book in the chat a couple of times. It'll take you to the Politics and Prose website, where I hope you'll buy the book and then check out our events page. And we'd love to see you at another event soon. In the meantime, thank you again, ladies. Thank you, everyone. Stay well and stay well read. Take care. Bye-bye.